Lucas, one thing we also have to take note of at this time of year is that it is football season. Football season is upon us as we're recording this episode. College football games are already in full swing. Lucas has been stealthily checking his phone under the table and making sure he's all paid up with his bookies. No, I'm only kidding. But I want to talk about an NFL story that's also kind of related to faith at a human level. It's a story of interest. And in the preseason, in the NFL preseason that just concluded, another big story that came out a few days ago was involving your very own Miami Dolphins. And tell us about this.
Yeah, so Tua Tagovailoa, who people were talking about him a lot over the summer, wondering whether or not the Dolphins were going to extend his contract or let him go or trade him. And after much negotiating, they finally made a deal, which was exciting. And by the way, Mike McDaniel just signed a contract extension a day ago. So I was really excited about that because I really like him a lot, and I think he's doing a really good job down there in Miami. But Tua Tagovailoa was on the Dan Le Batard show, and Dan Le Batard, for those of you who don't know, he is a sports journalist, and he covers all things South Beach, Miami sports.
Yeah.
And they were having a conversation, and Dan Le Batard asked him, how he's grown as an athlete over the last few years. And then he asked him what difference it's made having Mike McDaniel as a coach. And Tua had this to say.
Yeah, let's check out this clip from Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa in conversation with Dan Le Batard.
If you woke up every morning and I told you you sucked at what you did, that you don't belong doing what you do, that you shouldn't be here, that this guy should be here, that you haven't earned this right, and then you have somebody else come in and tell you, dude, you are the best fit for this. Like, you are accurate, you are the best whatever, you are this, you are that. Like, how would it make you feel listening to one or the other? You see what I'm saying? And then you hear it, regardless of what it is, the good or the bad. And you hear it more and more, you start to actually believe that.
So this clip is super interesting to me because it just highlights the importance of the words that we use and how we can really, by what we say, either build someone up and speak life into them, or really kind of bring them down and put them into a negative space. And so I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts, Cale, as you kind of saw this happen in the news?
And by the way, the coach who had been tearing Tua down verbally was Brian Flores. In case we didn't mention that before, Brian Flores was the Dolphins head coach prior to Mike McDaniel taking over. Brian Flores was a very highly regarded defensive coach, was the defensive coordinator for the New England Patriots during some of their dynasty years under head coach Bill Belichick. And obviously he used an old school type of motivation. And this was, as ESPN reporter who covers the Dolphins and the NFL, Jeff Darlington, said recently on ESPN, the treatment of Tua, the franchise quarterback in Miami, what was a huge reason why. It's probably the reason why Brian Flores was let go as coach. And the relationship that Tua has now with Mike McDaniel, as he alluded to in the clip, is so much more positive. And I agree with you on every front there. And the words that we use, and of course, the word in general, of course, Jesus is the living word of God. The words that we use, the messages that we give to others, that we tell ourselves, are so crucial to get right. And I wanted to just share a scripture, which we're all familiar with, that I thought of immediately when I heard the story. And it's from, of course, the letter of James. And in James chapter 3, it talks about taming the tongue. He says, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, for you know that we who teach shall be judged with greater strictness. For we all make many mistakes. And if anyone makes no mistakes in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body also. If we put bits into the mouths of horses that they may obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So the tongue is a little member and boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is an unrighteous world among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the cycle of nature, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing, my brethren. This ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening fresh water and brackish? Can a fig tree, my brethren, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. And that's an incredible passage from James on the power of the tongue, the power of our words, and how hard it is to keep that under control.
Yeah, and so it's funny that James came into mind for you, but the first reflection I kind of had after listening to this was I thought of Barnabas. And in the Acts of the Apostles, we hear about Barnabas traveling with Paul a lot in their kind of missionary journeys. And the name Barnabas means son of encouragement.
Right.
And there is a fascinating episode in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 9, verses 26 to 28. So this is right after Saul experiences Christ on the road to Damascus and has this conversion moment on the road to Damascus, and then is kind of reeling from this and trying to make sense of it all. And he's preaching in Damascus, and then he's wanting to go to Jerusalem. And it says, and when he, that is Paul, had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord, who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. So he went in and out among them at Jerusalem. So what I love about this is that Barnabas, if it wouldn't have been for Barnabas, who knows if Paul ever would have linked up with the apostles, with the disciples there in Jerusalem, and what would have happened. It took Barnabas kind of stepping in and saying, like, no, Paul is legit. Like, he's got it. You know, he's been preaching boldly in our name, and he's with us. He can do this. And I just think about, like, you know, how important it is to have people in your life who are willing to speak life into you, and to surround yourselves with good people who are going to be like, you know, you've got this. And who can just tell it to you straight too, like even when you're being stupid, who can just kind of be like, hey, you know, speak truth into your life, because that builds us up. And personally, I am like, I don't know if you've ever done the love languages thing, Cale. But
I know what they are. Do I always practice them? Not as much as I should.
Yeah, same here. But for me, I've always been like a words of affirmation person, and like I know, like if somebody says something, like it can just really build me up. And so I just think that like what Mike McDaniel's been able to do with Tua has been great, and I'm excited for this football season, and hopefully the Dolphins will take the AFC East this year. We'll see.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mike McDaniel and Tua as well, obviously, the two of them together, I mean, they've created offensive magic with Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, and all the weapons the Dolphins have. It's on the defensive side of the ball where there have been problems over the last 3 years. Of course, a new coordinator every year for the last 3 years. So we'll see what happens on that front. But there's no question that Tua is in a much better place because of the encouragement that he got from Mike McDaniel, who has been essentially a Barnabas figure to him. And we should probably tell our listeners too, just in case they don't know, when we refer to the love languages, there's a book called I think it's called The 5 Love Languages. I don't know what the actual title is, but it's by Gary Chapman. And the 5 love languages are just like, we all like all of these things, but some people kind of major in one or two of them. What's your dominant love language? So the love languages are words of affirmation. Lucas mentioned that. Physical touch, gift giving. I think, or they like people like to
Yeah.
receive gifts is one thing. What else? What are the other ones? I'm drawing
Yeah.
a
One
blank
of the other
here.
ones is quality time.
Quality time. Yeah.
And what is the last one? I
The
actually
last
don't even
one.
remember.
Neither do I, which probably means we're not great at this. But having said that, yeah. So those are the 5 love languages, and we can Google them really quickly and find out what they are. But this whole episode also called to mind an interesting interview that I heard in another podcast. It was called the Knowledge Project podcast, hosted by Shane Parrish, who writes the very cool Farnham Street blog. And in this particular episode of the Knowledge podcast show, Shane Parrish interviewed a guy named Dr. Jim Lohr. Dr. Jim Lohr is a high performance coach. He's written tons of books. He, in fact, was the co-founder of the Human Performance Institute. He's worked with elite athletes all around the world, including 17 number 1 ranked pro athletes in various sports, including tennis. And this was a really interesting episode because he talked about really the power of the tongue and the stories that we tell ourselves, and sometimes the stories that other people tell us. And you heard Tua say in the clip that I don't care who you are. I don't care how high up on the food chain you may be, socially speaking. If somebody tells you the same thing for 2 years straight, you're going to start to believe it. I don't care who you are. So these scripts that we hear, and very often the internal monologue that we have going on all the time, is just so crucial to get right. And in this episode, Jim Lohr talked about the fact that he has 3 sons, and as a dad, so all the parents out there listening, this is crucially important. As a dad, he wished he had realized this sooner, because we had this story going through our mind all the time. There's what we say publicly to other people out loud, and then there's what we tell ourselves, this internal story. And philosophers have noted this for a long time. And I remember the first time I read this, I didn't quite understand this at the time. This idea that everything that we know about the world comes to us through the senses. You probably heard about this, Lucas. You probably studied this. Through our 5 senses, that's how we apprehend reality. So whether it's our hearing, what we hear from people, what we touch, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, all that stuff, we don't have direct contact with the real world, quote unquote. It's all mediated through the senses. Like we do, but it's mediated through the senses, if that makes any sense. So we take in all this sense data, and then the big neuroprocessor up here has to make sense of it all. And Jim Lohr said the more that he understood this as a dad, he started to say, my goodness, the way that I've been talking to my 3 sons, I really, really have to take heed of that, because there are certain individuals in our lives, especially when we're very young and in our formative years. He says that their voice can bypass all of our defenses, and it goes right to the command center. And those voices and what we hear from these people are internalized right away. And a great example of that would be the voice of a parent, the voice of a mother, the voice of a father. What you're telling your children, it's going to bypass. With somebody else, maybe you might say, I'll take that with a grain of salt. But the parent's voice, especially when you're a kid, it goes straight, bypasses all those anti-malware, programs or whatever, and it gets directly incorporated. And he says that the public voice of the parent to the child becomes the private voice of the child in their internal dialogue. So, for example, if a parent says, why are you such a failure all the time? Why are you such a screw up? Why do you keep messing up? You're just worthless. You'll never amount to anything. That child, I guarantee you, is going to internalize that somehow. And that is not what you want. And so our brains are kind of always listening. And we have to really, really be careful about what we pour into other people's lives, and really kind of be aware of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and what we're capable of. And we know that as Catholics, we're capable of great sanctity. We're called to be canonizable saints. It's not just for other people. Like there should be a stained glass window of Lucas Holt in some parish someday.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if he's going to have his signature hoodie on or whatever, but I don't know. But maybe his skateboard and his Miami Dolphins hat. I don't know. But there's going to be it's kind of like the Carlo Acutis motif, if you will. But this is really important to understand the stories we tell ourselves. And I wrote down a couple of quotes that Jim Lohr said in this program. He talked about a guy named James Pennebaker, who is a researcher at the University of Texas. And the question was really about, well, okay, if we recognize that we have a bad script in our head, like Tua had this really bad script in his head that was planted by Brian Flores, his coach, this authority figure that, you stink, you're not going to make it. I'd rather have anybody else a quarterback other than you. So how are you supposed to rewrite the script? One of the ways that this guy, James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, says to do it is through writing. He says you've got to write, because there's been all kinds of evidence about this kinetic connection between the hand and the brain. And I've heard this is true at a lot of private schools as well. They're getting away from a lot of the digital tech that's used in the classroom these days and getting people back to maybe what we grew up with, cursive writing, handwriting, writing down your notes. Because I don't know if you found this to be true, Lucas, but I certainly have in my life, that when you write something down by hand, your notes that you have by hand, if you want to draw your own diagrams, even if it doesn't make sense to anybody else, it helps you to internalize and remember things. And so what this guy Pennebaker says to do is you've got to start writing and journaling and sort of reframing and rewriting your script. You can reframe a situation in a much more positive way. If something, let's say you lose your job, and this has happened, to me, you lose your job, you could say, well, this is a disaster. My world's crumbling down. You could say, this is an opportunity. You can reframe it and say, no, I'm a survivor. Or that's a much better reframe than saying, the world's crashing in. Try to look at things positively. And so rewriting your inner dialogue about who you are, what you're capable of, what your story is, and then telling it to yourself. So he says, make a voice recording and read what you wrote in your journal and then play it back to yourself, internalize it. So it's kind of interesting. Like there's so many ways that we can do this as Catholics and say, I am a child of God. I'm a son of God. I'm a daughter of God. I am destined to live for eternity with him. I am destined to be a canonizable saint. Now, that might sound like arrogance. It's not, because God is the one who makes it happen. But it's just stuff like that. I just found that to be so interesting, and kind of that was a connection I made with this story.
I love that. I think it's great. As I was listening to you speak, Cale, I was reminded of this past week I listened to the newly released Out of Pocket with RG3 podcast. So Robert Griffin III, former quarterback at Baylor and in the NFL, and was recently dropped by ESPN. Now he's doing his own thing, but he had Deion Sanders on his show, who's now coach at Colorado. And by the way, they beat North Dakota State. Their opening game. I love watching. I'm not a Colorado fan, but I have to say that they're a very fun team to watch. But anyway, it was a really interesting podcast because Deion Sanders obviously has sons who play on Colorado.
Yes, that's
right.
And
we're talking a little bit about fatherhood in the podcast, and Sanders faces criticism sometimes from people saying, oh, you're playing your sons because they're your sons or whatever. And
nepotism.
And anyway, so he was asked, like, what would you say to a child of yours, like if they're growing up and they're playing sports or whatever? He said, you don't have to be the best, but you got to do your best.
Yeah.
You got to put forth your best. And I love that because I'm just like, I feel like especially in today's culture, kids are under so much pressure from their parents to perform well in school, in sports, or whatever. Yeah. And it's like, you don't have to be the best, but you got to do your best. And I really like that a lot. And it's interesting, what you were saying about the script that a kid will tell themselves from their parents. And I'm just thinking of myself as a dad with a 2-year-old. Like, I really gotta watch the words that I use when I'm talking to my son, like that. speaking life into him and still disciplining him,
Yeah.
but having the opportunity as his father to speak life into him and to be a positive role model and somebody that he can look up to. It's a scary responsibility, but it's also really special and rewarding. So, yeah, I don't know. It's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
no, I love that, Lucas, and it's so true. And Jim Lohr on the podcast talked about Novak Djokovic, who many people feel, and you can argue about this, is maybe the greatest tennis player of all time. When he was first learning the game, he had a teacher, his first tennis teacher, and she noticed that of all the other kids in the group, like he just seemed to possess some really natural gifts, even at a very young age. And she told him that. She said, "Listen, I think you have incredible potential in this game." And just her saying that caused him to believe that. And the positive reinforcement. I think about Tiger Woods' dad, Earl, and obviously he had his issues, but one of the things that he always did was he instilled a belief in Tiger. I mean, he would say things like, "Let the legend grow," and things like that. And Tiger really bought into this. And I think that his dad really gave him the confidence to really go for it and believe, yeah, I can be great. And this idea of always doing your best, that's really all we can ask. Okay, so we looked up what the last of the 5 love languages are, and it's acts of service. And the fact that we didn't know that, like I said, maybe means that we're not so great at that. But we'll ask our wives. No, we don't want to ask our wives. We don't want to know the uncomfortable truth. But having said that, we're doing this podcast as a service to humanity, are we not? Yeah, there we go. But what you were saying earlier too about Lucas about trying your best. That also reminds me of a book called The Four Agreements. I talked about this once on Relevant Radio, and it's a book of Toltec spirituality, which I do not buy into at all. But having said that, the concepts of the book and what the Four Agreements are, we can easily apply those to the Catholic life. And they are as follows. By the way, Tom Brady was really into this book too at a crucial point in his career. Number one, be impeccable with your word. We talked about in this episode the power of the word. Of course, Jesus is the Word of God incarnate. The idea that our words carry weight and we should mean what we say. We should take care with what we say, and we should do what we say we're going to do. So be impeccable with your word, number one. Number two, never make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. We can save ourselves a lot of grief just by following this one. The third one is never take anything personally. Never take anything personally. When horrible things are done to us, it often has nothing to do with us. When people disagree with us, it's all about that other person. They're acting from their own hurts and weaknesses and maybe lack of formation that they didn't get growing up, whatever. It's not about you at all in most cases. And then the last one is always do your best, and your best is going to vary from day to day. If you're not feeling well, if you're under the weather, if you didn't get enough sleep the night before, you're stressed out about different things, there are various constraints. As long as you're doing your best, and you know what that is, you know whether you've given it the old college try, if you will, when you look in the mirror at the end of the night. That's it. And I love that. I love those 4 agreements, and we can easily incorporate those.
So it's funny because I thought about that very first one that you mentioned. There's in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 36. It says that, I'm paraphrasing here, but it says like essentially every idle word that you speak, you will be held accountable for on the day of judgment. And that is a haunting verse. I'm just always like, wow. Yeah, every single word we use matters.
Yeah, that's right. And there are several listening devices out there, whether it's Alexa or even Siri. Well, God is definitely recording everything that we're saying. There's no question
Ooh.
about that. And
That's an interesting thought. God is
it
recording
is.
what we're saying. I
He's
don't want
not
to
gonna
hear the
forget it.
playback at the
No,
gates. I don't want to hear the playback.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hope that gets erased. And but no, it's a sobering thought for sure, especially in the age of social media. What we say online, we could try to hide behind a keyboard, but that counts too. And But anyway, so yeah, just lots to think about. The power of words: to encourage, to build up, to tear down. We've got
Yeah.
to be so cognizant of the scripts that we give ourselves and others. So I think we'll leave it there, Lucas. We covered a lot of ground here in this episode of the Cale Clark Show. I want to remind everybody to tell a friend about the program. Share this episode. Use the share tools if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or on YouTube Podcasts. If you are watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button as well. Go to caleclark.com, C-A-L-E, Clark with an E.com, and you can sign up for the email list. We'll let you know first whenever new episodes appear and any other awesome news that we've got for you. So for producer Lucas Holt, this is Cale Clark.